Leviticus chapter 13, Holman Christian Standard Bible. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron. When a person has a scab, swelling, or a spot on the skin of his body, and it becomes a disease on the skin of his body, he is to be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons the priest. The priest will examine the infection on the skin of his body. If the hair in the infection has turned white and the infection appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is a skin disease. After the priest examines him, he must pronounce him unclean. But if the spot on his body is white and does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and the hair in it has not turned white, the priest must quarantine the infected person for 7 days. The priest will then re-examine him on the seventh day. If he sees the infection remains unchanged and is not spread on the skin, the priest must quarantine him for another days. The priest will examine him again on the seventh day. If the infection has faded and not spread on the skin, the priest is to pronounce him clean. It is a scab. The person is to wash his clothes and will become clean. But if the scab spreads further on the skin after he has presented himself to the priest for his cleansing, he must present himself again to the priest. The priest will examine him, and if the scab has spread on the skin, then the priest must pronounce him unclean. He has a skin disease. When a skin disease develops on a person, he is to be brought to the priest. The priest will examine him. If there's a white swelling on the skin that has turned the hair white, and there's a patch of raw flesh in the swelling, it is a chronic disease on the skin of his body, and the priest must pronounce him unclean. He need not quarantine him, for he is unclean. But if the skin disease breaks out all over the skin so that it covers all the skin on the affected person from his head to his feet, so that as far as the priest can see, the priest will look, and if the skin disease has covered his entire body, he is to pronounce the infected person clean. Since he has turned totally white, he is clean. But whenever the raw flesh appears on him, he will be unclean. When the priest examines the raw flesh, he must pronounce him unclean. Raw flesh is unclean, it is a skin disease. But if the raw flesh changes and turns white, he must go to the priest. The priest will examine him, and if the infection has turned white, the priest must pronounce the infected person clean. He is clean. When a boil appears on the skin of the body and it heals, and a white swelling or a reddish white spot develops where the boil was, the person must present himself to the priest. The priest will make an examination, and if the spot seems to be beneath the skin and the hair in it has turned white, the priest must pronounce him unclean. It is a skin disease and is broken out into a boil. But when the priest examines it, if there's no white hair in it, and it is not beneath the skin but it has faded, the priest must quarantine him for 7 days. If it spreads further on the skin, the priest must pronounce him unclean. It is an infection. But if the spot remains where it is and is not spread, it is only a scar from the boil. The priest is to pronounce him clean. When there is a burn on the skin of one's body produced by a fire, the patch made raw by the burn becomes reddish white or white. The priest is to examine it. If the hair on the spot has turned white and the spot appears to be deeper than the skin, it is a skin disease that has broken out in the burn. The priest must pronounce him unclean. It is a skin disease. When the priest examines it, if there is no white hair in the spot and it is not beneath the skin but is faded, the priest must quarantine him 7 days. The priest will re-examine him on the seventh day. If it has spread further on the skin, the priest must pronounce him unclean. It is a skin disease. But if the spot has remained where it was and has not spread on the skin but has faded, it is the swelling from the burn. The priest is to pronounce him clean, for it is only a scar from the burn. When a man or woman has an infection on the head or chin, the priest must examine the infection. If it appears to be deeper than the skin and the hair in it is yellow and sparse, the priest must pronounce the person unclean. It is a scaly outbreak, skin disease on the head or chin. When the priest examines the scaly infection, if it does not appear to be deeper than the skin, there's no black hair in it, the priest must quarantine the person with a scaly infection for 7 days. The priest will re-examine the infection on the seventh day. If the scaly outbreak has not spread and there's no yellow hair in it and does not appear to be deeper than the skin, then the person must shave himself but not shave the scaly area. Then the priest must quarantine the person who has scaly outbreak for another 7 days. The priest will examine the scaly outbreak on the seventh day, and if it has not spread on the skin and does not appear to be deeper than the skin, the priest is to pronounce the person clean. He is to wash his clothes and he will be clean. But if the scaly outbreak spreads further on the skin after his cleansing, the priest is to examine the person. The scaly outbreak has spread on the skin. The priest does not need to look for yellow hair. The person is unclean. But if as far as he can see, the scaly outbreak remains unchanged and the black hair has grown in it, then it is healed. He is clean. The priest is to pronounce the person clean. When a man or a woman has white spots on the skin of the body, the priest is to make an examination. If the spots on the skin of the body are dull white, it is only a rash that is broken out on the skin. The person is clean. If a man loses the hair of his head, he is bald, but he is clean. or if he loses the hair at his hairline, he is bald on his forehead, but he is clean. But if there is a reddish-white infection on the bald head or forehead, skin disease breaking out on his head or his forehead, the priest must examine him, and if the swelling of the infection on his bald head or forehead is reddish-white, like the appearance of the skin disease on the body, the man is afflicted with a skin disease, he is unclean. The person must pronounce him unclean, the infection is on his head. The person afflicted with an infectious disease, with an infectious skin disease, is to have his clothes torn, and with his and his hair hanging loose, he must cover his mouth and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." He will remain unclean as long as he has the infection. He is unclean. He must live alone in a place outside the camp. If a fabric is contaminated with mildew in wool or linen fabric, in the warp or woof of linen or wool, or in the leather or anything made of leather, and if the contamination is green or red in fabric, leather, the warp, the woof, or any leather article, is a mildew contamination and is to be shown to the priest. The priest is to examine the contamination, and quarantine the contaminated fabric for 7 days. The priest is to re-examine the contamination on the 7th day. If it is spread in the fabric, the warp, the woof, or leather, regardless of how it is used, the contamination is harmful mildew. It is unclean. He is to burn the fabric, the warp, the woof, or in wool or linen or any leather article which is contaminated. Since it is harmful mildew, it must be burned up. When the priest examines it, if the contamination is not spread in the fabric, the warp, or the woof, or any leather article, the priest is to order whatever is contaminated to be washed and quarantined for another 7 days. After it has been washed, the priest is to re-examine the contamination. If the appearance of the contamination article has not changed, it is unclean. Even though the contamination is not spread, you must burn up the fabric. It is a fungus on the front or back of the fabric. If a priest examines it and the contamination has faded after it has been washed, he must cut the contaminated section out of the fabric, the leather, or the warp or woof. But if it reappears in the fabric, the warp or woof, or any leather article, it is broken out again. You must burn up whatever is contaminated. But if the contamination disappears from the fabric, the warp, the woof, or any leather article which have been washed, it is to be washed again, and it will be clean. This is the law concerning mildew contamination in the wool or linen fabric, warp or woof, or any leather article in order to pronounce it clean or unclean.